an open mind.
What fun. Have a great time. That's great.
I'll send you photos.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining in. I appreciate you taking time out of the day to listen in, but also please speak and participate in an exploration on how to listen and the dynamics of dancing amongst levels of listening. So to get started, I know that Manola and Kathy, you were both with the initial session, and I'd welcome kind of any key takeaways. And I know that we had talked about some homework assignments to kind of explore. Can we get started by maybe sharing kind of what's top of mind following the conversation last week? Hi, Anna.
I will just say that it really helped me to notice how poorly I'm listening these days, because I am so distracted by going in a million directions and have been fooling myself that I'm present. But I actually have not been. So I can't even remember our call last week. That's how, like, that's the honest truth. But I do know that. And so for me, that's a win. Like just noticing that and being aware of it, even though I don't like it, to me was worth the whole hour just to get that little bit.
Awesome. And let's just pause right there and celebrate that, because the first level is that of self-awareness. And that's what you've just expressed, was a level of self-awareness that you maybe were not as in tune with the week prior.
Right. Yeah. So thank you.
Manola?
Just building on what Kathy shared, the bit that stayed with me and it's still lingering on my mind is when we talked about that statement of, are we natural listeners? And we ended up discussing about the fact that we are natural hearers, in the sense that we are born with the sense of hearing, and how that hopefully through self-awareness mostly grows into this sense of listening as sense making and connecting, not just picking up sounds. So that is something that kept popping up in my mind. And just following Kathy's vulnerability share, I do remember the conversation, but I'm totally blanked out on the homework. And I just had a blast from my high school past. It's like, I can't remember. It's not that I did it and the dog ate it. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, if it's not written, it's not real, right? Is that concept of how do we really practice our listening and sketch making or doodling or note taking? But thank you. And that is an interesting thing to reflect on. Are we natural listeners? You know, we were born with the 2 ears. We have the sense making abilities with sight, sound, smell. But like any skill, it takes practice. So a couple of the takeaways I'd like to kind of add on just to bring everybody along in the conversation was the concept of stop, drop, and roll. So when you are approaching a conversation and perhaps whether you're caught off guard and somebody has something urgent they want to talk to you about, or it's a meeting that you have scheduled, but you're multitasking here or there, to stop, to just really physically, whether that's putting both feet flat on the ground, stop, be aware of your surroundings, your presence, your energy, drop, whether that's dropping your shoulders, dropping the pen, dropping your phone, turning it over, putting it in a desk, and then do something physical that's rolling. I tend to roll my thumb over my fingers to shift that energy of touch and focus. Manola shared that she puts on her little cuticle cream on her, the fingers. It could be that you are doing movement within your ankles to get that blood flow going and really shifting that energy of presence. Because if we just shift to click on or connect or mute or unmute, we haven't done anything intentional to shift our attention. The other piece that we talked about was we tend to rush by nature. And so what does it mean to exercise hush? So when you're feeling that sense of energy and transitioning and how you're going to show up to listen, and you're rushing to that next meeting, flip that and you use that play on words. Am I hushing my brain? You're not going to be able to silence it. Trust me, you're not. We're not wired that way. But can I hush it rather than have the rush control me and how I show up? We started with the question as well as identifying great leaders. Okay, that seemed to be a fairly simple topic for the group. We talked about identifying great speakers. Who is a great speaker that comes to mind? And that took a little bit more work, but we came up with some names. What about great listeners? Who comes to mind when you consider a great listener? It's a little bit harder, huh?
Maybe the Dalai Lama.
Okay. Say more about that. What type of presence or energy?
I mean, I don't know for sure because I probably haven't seen enough interactions, but from what I understand, it's, people want to be in his presence to experience, just the energy and the love. And it's not so much the conversation or it's more the emotion that's going on as opposed to a dialogue. So I think there's more listening going on there and then exuding kind of the energy that comes out of him.
And we'll revisit that. Thank you very much for adding that into the conversation. And we'll revisit it when we talk about creating that space for listening and how the Western culture, again, is driven by urgency rather controlling.
Yeah.
Urgency. Yeah, thank you. The other question that was posed that was reflected upon was, when does listening begin? And we had some great conversation about when listening begins. Is it when the other person speaks? Is it not? And where we landed with that is that first level of listening of self. Just much like a band or an orchestra, they don't show up and perform. They don't show up to play. They show up to tune in. Okay, they set the stage for listening or playing in their situation, but how are we setting our stage for listening? Okay, so that kind of brings up to speed a little bit more context. So I want you to be able to jump in and participate in the conversations as well. The next level of listening is something that we often speak to. Mindful listening, active listening. My guess is that many of you have taken a course on active listening or mindful listening, or something that you've studied or read up on. Would you agree? Seems to be a topic that companies and organizations kind of say, I want to talk about communication. In this one chapter within this curriculum, we're going to talk about active listening. Or perhaps it's more mindful listening, but then it leans too much towards meditation, which isn't really the mindfulness I'm speaking to. It's that action of listening for content.
See, I can't do that unless I'm writing something down. My retention is essentially 0. So for me to be an active listener, I have to take notes. I have to write things down because I don't retain.
And that ties into your learning strategy, your learning style. It could be that motion of read, write. You may not even go back and read your notes, right?
Right. That's correct.
Kinesthetic learners, the same thing. I mean, I never showed up. If we were here in person, you guys would have toys on your table, because I've worked with enough people of different learning styles that people need activity. People need permission to stand up at the back of the room. People need permission to be able to move about when they need to. You also need the permission to respect the person sitting next to you, who may really need you to sit at another table because you're too fidgety for the for the attention that they need to. And having those conversations about how you show up. And again, that's we're leaning more now into some of the context of how we're setting our environment, but that's how content plays. Okay.
This is
strategy.
fascinating.
Go ahead, Manala.
Sorry, this is fascinating because if I start to take notes, I stop listening. It's almost as if I'm, delegating listening by proxy. I'm not here. I'm just taking notes, and I can't remember how many times I was in uncomfortable situations, and I was the only one around a table in a meeting, not taking notes, and I was called out saying, like, why don't you take notes? Why aren't you present? And I'm like, I am. If I take notes, I am as good as out of the room. So yeah, very interesting.
And that's oftentimes in a situation where you're in a meeting or perhaps in an interview, and you say, do you mind if I take notes? You just put it out there. It helps me process the information, and I can come back to it for questions that I may have later. Being honest and transparent about what that action is. It doesn't mean that I'm not engaged. It means that I'm listening differently in a style that is working for me. The other question, and we'll come back to that as well, Manol, when we talk about the 125, 400, 900, as to why that impression might have taken place. What does it mean to pay attention versus give attention?
This is Marisa. That's a very interesting question. I've never really thought about that, but paying attention reminds me of school, right? Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Whereas giving attention is like when you're having coffee with a loved one, or you're in a room with someone and you're focusing completely on them. And it's a much more personal approach than just paying attention for me.
Yeah, thank you, Marisa.
There's a quote that immediately popped up in my mind as you asked that question, and it's some people speak with you in their free time. Some people free their time to speak with you. And for me, and learn the difference. For me, this is a different way of saying paying attention and giving attention.
And there is no right or wrong. That's the beauty about the space, is that it's a movement, but there are cues that we can pick up on. For example, we may show up paying attention when we're expected to be giving attention. Right? So really identifying what that speaker is asking you to attend to as a listener. And because we tend to listen to similarities more than differences, we often tend to show up maybe in a different way than that was expected. So it could be simply posing the question of saying, hey, I'm glad we're having a chance to meet. Are you looking for me to be able to provide guidance, my sounding board? What is the context in which you would like me to show up today as a listener to what we're going to discuss? Might sound awkward at first, but it really helps that role clarity and helps you refocus and reframe on, we talked about expectations in a call earlier with Outlier Project, but becoming aligned with that. So we've been on airplanes. I would say most of us have been on an airplane before. And the flight attendant comes on, you're getting all situated, and they're going through the emergency procedures, right? Are you paying attention? Are you giving attention? How are you attending to the sound as a listener? I would say if you're just getting ready and the flight's ready to go, it's going to be very different than if you're in flight, you hit some turbulence, you hit some more turbulence, you get a change in altitude real quick, and that flight attendant comes on and revisits some of the emergency procedures. Your energy and attention has completely shifted in that moment. Manola.
Probably because of, you know, just how many videos are there, you know, either making fun or simply funny about flight safety instructions. For me, the difference is, you know, you pay attention maybe when you're a first-time flyer or, you know, when you're a nervous flyer. But what I try to do is to really watch that out of sheer respect of someone doing their job. And also that makes me think that the difference between paying attention and giving attention is the intention behind the attention. This sounds very funny, but yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Cher. Thank you. And what that is unspoken in that situation that we'll be moving towards is a value of respect that you carry. Okay, so that uncovers that a little bit more. So it's not uncommon for us to think that we're attending to a conversation in a way where we're hearing and we're seeing and we're sensing. Using a strategy for focus of looking at the speaker's eyes to the mouth in kind of a triangle motion. Okay, that's going to help amplify that the content moving to the context of the emotions that the person is bringing, being more in tune with the word choice and the word selection, and then listening for mismatches. If somebody is using words that are perhaps misaligned with maybe their energy. This is often in team meetings where people maybe are just going along with something because they just want to wrap up the meeting, or they don't want to be the disruptor and such, but you can start to read some of the angst or how they're shifting in their chair. And then as the facilitator, how do you move then as the listener to discover what is unsaid? I mentioned 125, 400, and 900. So the average speaker's cadence is 125 words per minute. When I get really excited about something I'm passionate about, I can speak a little bit faster than that, and I begin to trip over my words because I'm thinking at 900 thoughts per minute. Okay, you can listen on average about 400 words per minute. There's some pretty quick listeners that are already formulating their next thoughts, their answers, they're getting their shopping list built in the right corner of their mind, and they're remembering what they're doing this evening or making for dinner on the left side. And so all these thoughts are moving around. Essentially, you're listening to me 4 times faster than I can speak. That creates a lot of room for communication. Okay. So one of the things I shared with the group last week was the analogy of focus. So we're kind of beginning with setting that stage for focus, fostering your mindfulness and being open-minded and willing to show up as a listener. We're going to lean more into creating a safe space, but within that space of you listening, we are bringing our self-bias, right? We have an unconscious bias that's formulating where you think I'm going to go next, or what I have to say, or what you've already thought that's similar to that experience in the past. And when we do that, we end up moving more towards a sympathetic response than an empathetic response, because it's a cleaner match. We listen for similarities, which lean towards sympathy, versus differences that create space for us exploring differences towards empathy. And so when we think of some of Brené Brown's work and cultivating meaningful connection, it's how are we listening? What are we attending to? What's the, as Manola said, the intention behind the listening conversation? Okay, so moving a little bit more onto, because I want to get to the meat of what is unsaid and the meaning today. So we talk about space and creating space, moving from content to context. And one of the things that we know is that listening is situational and relational. Some people are more wired to listen to numbers and statistics, where others are more attuned to listening to adjectives and descriptors and tone. So when there is a mismatch, seeking clarity and aligned understanding is really important, because the mismatch is going to create the mind wandering much faster. How many of you would say that you feel like you are a great listener on a scale of 1 to 5? Hold up your numerical, 1 being I'm not a great listener, 5 being Jackie, I should be up here speaking. 2s, 3s, 4s. Yeah, 4s. And a lot of it, there again, there's no right or wrong. And I would say that depending on the context and how we're being asked to show up, the timing, it's situational, right, Kathy? It is a situational, and which is why really understanding the 5 levels of listening and becoming dynamic and moving from one to the other is so key. If you think about it, the first draft of what I'm speaking is only 14% of what's on my mind. And Timothy, you'll appreciate this, Tim. So the idea is to think like an editor. Okay. So if you read a first draft, what are your thoughts that you're going back to that author with, Tim?
That would depend on what kind of work that particular project needs. Sometimes I might suggest, this, it might need like a whole overhaul and like a lot of rewriting. In other cases, it might just be like, hey, this just needs, maybe just a proofread and just like a light edit.
Okay. Do you find yourself, or tell me more, or go back to the beginning, or what are you trying to say here? Are you posing exploratory questions back to the writer?
Yeah, I might point things out saying, this is what you say, but is this what you mean? Mm-hmm. And try to get them to rewrite it so it does say what they mean versus, it's saying something where it could have a totally different interpretation.
Thank you. So now translate that into a project team meeting. Live in the moment. Somebody asks, okay, we just got wrapped up a 6-month quality improvement project engineering thing. And we're saying, okay, how do you feel? How would you describe that project? You've put in a lot of hours. I know we hit some roadblocks. The outcome may not have been exactly aligned with what we're expected. What are some words that might come up when you ask that team to describe the project?
Jackie, would you ask that question again so I can understand a little bit? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we're looking for response from you as part of a project team. You just got done with a 6-month quality improvement project. It may have gone over budget. It may not have hit all the objectives, but it's to a point that it's being implemented. What are some words that you might describe as a project team member? If you were asked, how are you? How would you describe the project? Where are you at with it? We might hear words like, it was really frustrating.
I'd say we're probably more focused now than we were when we started.
Okay, so you're taking away that something you've learned, you've focused on making progress. Some people may have felt like it was never ending.
I don't know if I'm making sense of this, but if you're on a project, leadership is a critical aspect of that. Is someone providing encouragement and keeping people on task and focused on outcomes and milestones, et cetera. So I would be making comments around that.
Yeah, so how was it facilitated? Where was the communication? So now, as you dive into this and you're unpacking it as the team lead, saying, you know, what are those lessons that are learned? And it could be that you discover that it was communication that was an issue. And you dive a little bit deeper, and now you discover there was a key component of trust missing, which is why some of the timelines or the outcomes were not hit in the way that would have been expected. Yet nobody uses the word communication or trust when they're debriefing on the project. Okay, so that's part of moving from the content of the words that are being used, considering the context of a group meeting. Is that the right context to explore and dive deeper in to what is unsaid? Manola?
I was thinking that if I were the project lead, more than listening to the words that people actually express, I would much rather pay more attention to how long it takes them to actually start to speak about it. You know, their body language, and do they wait on each other for someone to break the ice? And for me, that speaks louder than the words they will eventually vocalize.
That's part of your change management guruism that you bring to the table, is being able to read what is unspoken. So how do you bring the unspoken forward in that context? Or do you?
I think the unspoken is there, and the art is more around how do you acknowledge it and make it part of the conversation, and not use it as, you know, elephant in the room food. And as people will start to actually speak up, you might realize that that's not the time or the place to address the unsaid. But just knowing that is there and acknowledging it, and making a decision whether you acknowledge it publicly or not. That's something. And it goes back to what you said, you know, who are the great listeners? I do believe that there are jobs / roles / vocations that bring out the natural listener in you. And also this is something that is attributed to Nelson Mandela, you know, with leaders speak last. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other thoughts? One way to bring that forward is to reframe where you're listening from and where they may be speaking from, and posing questions We show up oftentimes first with self. So you're listening through the lens of, or listening for the me, the I, the mine. This is my role. This is what I did, versus the other. And when we're listening for the other, there could be an energy shift, which really gets to some of what Nola was saying is the unsaid with relationships. They, the team, the department. Okay. When that other is being spoken, there's more unsaid, because we always know there's more than one part to a story. And then there's the system. Where is the speaker at in relation to the system, the organization, the board, the vendor? So listening to what preference they're leaning towards when they're speaking the story of their project role and the outcome. And then, as Manola was aware, the time. Is that the time to dive in? Is it something where you really take notice that maybe it's a one-on-one follow-up, or it's a place to circle back to when there's better energy, time, attention? It's okay to check the timing. Okay. Again, we tend to rush because we want to get this all done at the end of the meeting. And when we do that, we often miss the underlying festering points and friction points to what's on the table. The other piece with that is thinking about the adjectives as capitals. So when you hear adjectives, think of capital letters of emphasis, and don't focus so much on the word, but what's behind that you can then explore through tell me more, or take me back to the beginning. Where are they starting with the story? Who else was there? Where were we at in the project when that occurred? Okay. So trying to uncover some of what is unsaid as the derailers. And the pause. How many counts can you count to in silence before your discomfort creates voice?
Well, I'll be the first to speak up and say not very many.
Not very many, right? What kind of relationship do we have in the Western culture with silence?
Very bad.
Uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Deafening silence. Awkward silence. Can you think of a positive word that we've used to describe silence?
Time for reflection. I guess that's 3 words.
Time for reflection. We're describing
Right.
silence. So kind of going back to the Dalai Lama early on and considering, that space of silence, and centering that power and that energy. And that's just not something that we're comfortable with, because it creates, one, our thoughts are continuing to roll, and then it's awkward. We've been told it's awkward. We don't know how to show up in silence. What are we supposed to do? It's not meaningful time spent. We've got things to do. We need to move on to the next thing. Okay. But then it competes oftentimes with the evolution of discovery of an optimal or unknown project. So I think of like rising bread. And this is important in a timing conversation as well. What happens if you wait to add yeast or pose that thoughtful, tell me more, or where do we go next with this, 10 minutes before the meeting ends? What happens if you wait 80% into making bread that you add the yeast? What's the outcome? If you don't add yeast at the right time and letting your bread rise, it's not going to be the best outcome. It's going to be hard. It's going to be flat. Okay, it's not going to be well received. If you wait until the last minutes of a meeting to say, you know, I have a different take on that. What happens sometimes to the shift of the energy in the room? I know we've experienced this before.
I think people either want to defend their position, or else it opens up the floodgates and you have other differing opinions spoken.
And so then the floodgates open and there's differing opinions. And everybody's here, they're doing this. We got 10 minutes left. Seriously, like we were already at a resolution. So listening does what?
Right.
It stops. We don't have the space for that right now. We're already 80% towards a resolution and you're bringing this in. And so now I'm going to label you as either a stonewaller or a disruptor or not a great team member or not compliant. You know, all these judge words start coming to mind. Okay. Again, because of the context and the timing and the space, all interplaying in how we're showing up to listen.
So Jackie, let me drill down, because is that a bad thing? Because if you're working in a group setting and you got to make progress, and we've all met these people who show up to the meetings, their body language is telling you, if they're not verbally saying it, that they're not engaged. And we get down to a critical juncture, and all of a sudden, that's when they speak up with all their brilliance and tell us that they're not really into the project, etc. And I have to tell you, for me personally, that is perhaps the most assured way to get a negative reaction out of me. So is it bad when you're bringing that judging attitude to the conversation?
It depends, right? So one of the things that we miss as organizations and team facilitators when we're working on projects or doing group things is role clarity, right? That's, you know, thank you for bringing that thought to the attention. You know, I will circle back with you on a one-on-one because I want to dive a little bit more into what you're thinking in the context of where we're at in this conversation. You're validating, you're acknowledging, but it might not be the right time or the place. Now you need to be intentional about going back and exploring that, because you don't know what lens that idea came from. And it could have been a significant lens that's impacting a stakeholder that wasn't brought forward. Okay, and then at that time, you can identify how to bring that back into the group or the team setting. Now, when there's real clarity and they're not, I mean, we don't racy charts and using different systems and structures like that. We oftentimes just want to give voice, and everybody wants things to be democratic and consensus, and that's not reality. I mean, there are times for that space of listening and creative tension, but there's also times, again, what is our role in how we show up as listening? And then what is the timing? And then what is unsaid? So what's going on with that individual who spoke, you know, either against or late in the game? And that's where kind of pulling that aside and then interjecting that back up. But the more you can start saying, tell me more about that, or let's go back to the beginning. And you can do that in a group setting. You're moving the group along with you, but that's really key as a facilitator. And as a facilitator, your role is that of speaking, yes, but really listening. You know, being able to balance that. We also get caught on numbers by nature. So take the example of an air traffic controller and flight number 1529. And the pilot checks in, says his flight number 1529, is talking with the air traffic controller, is experiencing some engine problem, something is going on, and they're having to quickly track this flight and get it to safe landing. Within the context of this conversation of this airplane landing safely, the flight number was misspoken in 14 different ways. 1549, 1529, 1592. If the air traffic controller gets fixed on that flight number, it delays a safe outcome of that plane landing. So when we get too fixed on where we're at with a % of completion in a project or a missed mark or number or metric, and we don't open ourselves to explore different ways to get to that outcome, that's the impact of just listening for words and listening to correct, which we're wired to do, versus listening towards the best outcome given the situation, the timing, and the moment. And this isn't easy to do, right? This is all in the moment. You're facilitating that project team when somebody speaks up, you're about to wrap up, and now everybody's up at arms. That's when the team's messaging boards gets on fire, the people are picking up the phone, the chat messages, all of that talk happens outside, you know. A lot of that talk is not additive. But sometimes it is because they're processing their emotion on the situation. When did you, if you were to pick a time and say, this is when I first really understood listening or became curious about listening. This is when I first remembered listening. There was probably some type of story, interaction, something took place. And you're like, wow, I really heard that. Marissa, you came off mute. Did you have something?
I did. I was thinking, well, it wasn't deep or sensitive, but I remember I was in college and I was a resident assistant, and kind of the summer before the semester started, you know, we had to come for like a month of training and all this kind of stuff. And they taught us at the time some communication skills, and it's a really quick little modeling thing. If you had a resident who was struggling with something or whatever, they came to you. We were like the first, I don't even know if they still do this, but we were the first line of like accessing resources for our residents in our hall. And you had to learn this model, which was, so I heard you say this, it sounds like you're trying to say this or that or whatever. So it was like this quick little modeling of reflecting back what you heard them say and clarifying and clarifying and clarifying. And I've always kept that model, and I found myself using it, you know, 30 years later when I had my children or whatever. And it's just one of those things that's like, it's stuck in my brain somewhere. I don't even know if that's still a good model or whatever, but that was the first time in my life that I was like taught or encouraged or in a position where I really had to pay attention to what someone else was saying, and knowing that if the person was coming to me, there was usually some kind of crisis or it was very heightened emotion. So it was learning to separate the emotional response to falling on this communication modeling to calm everything down a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great example of how we lean into that, that active listening, and that listening where we're listening to summarize, we're listening to mirror, we're listening to paraphrase. The challenge with that is it brings our emotion and our meaning an attempt to try to connect with someone else's.
Yeah.
And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so again, shifting from, again, that active listening where you're then probing for the questions, which is a common communication skill that we learn, is shifting it more towards what's important for you about this outcome. What are your non-negotiables? What would great look like? And having them start to use some more words to be able to get better context and then start discovering some of what is unsaid. Given all of this, where would you like to focus? I don't know if any of you have ever followed any of Cy Wakeman's work, but I've got some background in healthcare, and so she's done some of that. But she says, you know, people will show up and they're going to show up for a one-on-one or a meeting or some of my time, and they park their BMW in the chair in front of me. They park their bitchy, moony, whiny butt in the chair in front of me. Okay. And so I just love that whole BMW and that energy. And we've seen that, we've been in that situation. And, you know, are you here because you want to vent? Are you here because, you know, what is that that you're bringing forward? Okay. Now, given that, what is your role in this situation? What would great look like? What actions can you take for this to be moving towards great? And we often tend to jump in as the problem solver or the solutions or the sympathizer. Manola.
I just want to share back to your previous question. What was the moment that really, you know, triggered intention behind listening? And for me, that happened in school. I was 10, so I grew up in a bilingual family. In Romania, you had to learn at least 2 languages starting secondary school. So I started learning English when I was 10, and when I was 11, I had to go for my second at school, which was French. And my English teacher listened so differently from my French teacher. He knew that I was used to jumping between languages, but he always was patient with me finding my words. And going back to what you just said, my French teacher was the fixer. When she felt that I was searching for a word, she didn't give me that extra second to find a word in my brain, and she would offer it to me. But I didn't pick it as, it never felt like help. It felt like time's up. And that for me was the first big lesson on listening, especially helpful when within work environments, you know, English is people's second, if not third language.
That's a beautiful share, Manola. And for me as well, in talking about what is unsaid and even showing up here to lend insight and my thoughts with all of you whom I see as knowledgeable thought leaders with, you know, that people-centric approach who really just have a passion for how you show up every day. And if you were to pose that question to me, and this is part of why I feel like Manola, in a way, with our language and being heard has some commonality. I was probably close to 5 years old, and I was at the park with my father. And great, you know, I get to go to the park with Dad. I am feeling brave and confident, and he's encouraging me to climb up on the hanging bars, those bars that kind of have the different heights. They're probably banned from playgrounds today, who knows? But and he's like, you know, you can do this. You know, you can hang on the bars, and I'm really proud of myself. And I'm hanging upside down, and I start swinging, and I'm starting to slip. And I see my dad within just beyond arm's reach of me. And I'm saying, Dad, Daddy, Dad, Dad, like louder, more exclamatory. Next thing I know, I'm being rushed to the hospital because I've fallen, because he didn't hear me. And so there I am getting stitches, gravel removed, just all of the things. And, you know, I share that because that really, for me, was the first conversation of how am I showing up as a listener? How attentive am I? What is the presence? And what does it mean to be heard and to have a voice? And that just continued to evolve in a number of relationships over time, from whether it was just observing rote prayer in church, where you're just reciting, and what is the meaning within that action, to sirens, where One group of family taught me to hide when sirens come. Okay, I was not taught that they were the helpers until a much later stage of life. All the way through just a lot of diversity and classism. Okay, so I know how to defend my clothes at a very young age in a public laundromat. And I also know how to order in a French restaurant. And for me, the concept in creating space for people to have a voice, to be heard, touches on many different interactions I've had throughout each chapter of my life. And I studied abroad because honestly, it didn't make sense in the United States. People were talking about showing up with authenticity and telling your story. And, you know, I didn't see a lot of people comfortable in their own truth. So I really questioned a lot of the stories that were being told. Coming back, I started working with the English as a foreign language populations and refugees, and then moved that forward into how do leaders show up in the workplace and what investing of their own self are they doing to receive people who may speak differently. And so that's some of my passion about what is unsaid and discovering the meaning about the concept of listening in communication and the way we work. And that's why the topic kind of was at the top of my mind of how to share different strategies and how we show up. Whether it's in, you know, a role where we are the decision makers and we're creating space. We are the receivers of employee surveys, and we're going through the action of listening to the survey, but we really don't go beyond what that percentage point is telling us about engagement into focus groups and listening rooms. And so I just encourage you to consider, when did you really first start thinking about communication to the depth of listening and what our roles are as listeners in that dialogue? And with that, I'm going to ask you to shift from focus to listening with care, listening with curiosity, exploring yourself as showing up as an authentic listener, recognizing when there is a backstory to maybe what somebody is telling you, and showing up with empathy. And we've got 5 minutes left, and there's some additional information, but I just want to say I appreciate your space and your time for the topic and want your insight and feedback as we close. I can count for a really, really long time. I've taught in college classrooms and I've taught in preschool classrooms. What are you going to take away from this, if anything? You did. Manola, I just caused an earthquake all the way over in Switzerland.
I'm sorry I missed the first part. I can say that I think that I really thought about listening just a few years ago in my training. I mean, I talk on the phone all the time and try to be, and you know, have always focused on listening, but that silence part of listening, that I've worked on more in the past probably 4 or 5 years, in saying something and then stopping myself from filling that blank.
Thank you, Jerry. Oftentimes, and I struggle with this. I mean, I always study what I struggle with, right? So I struggle with listening and communication. Good positioned questions are less than 8 words. If we want to fill the silence with a question, have it be a short comment or question. Because again, otherwise we are infusing our meaning and our emotion into the question rather than creating space for the person to respond. And then just a reminder that when we talk about listening, it's not meant to be heavy, right? If you approach listening as, I'm here to help the other person uncover and explore what they're trying to say, versus trying to fix what they're trying to say or correct what they're trying to say, that responsibility shifts from needing to be right or having an answer to being on an adventure of exploring their story. All right. Manola, did you have a closing thought? I know we're getting close to time, so I just want to give everybody.
You triggered a thought there, because I just realized a few seconds ago that when we talk about body language, we talk about body language through the lens of active speaking. But I wish there were more conversations and more intentionality behind body speaking when you're silent. And maybe that is what packages that silence as dismissive or uninteresting or disconnected, or I am here still replaying what you just said in my mind. I'm still listening to you. So that is something that I will take with me from the two sessions. Body language in silence, not just body language in speaking.
Thank you. So my goal number one was for each of you to be able to just have simply increased awareness on the role of listening in communication. And from there, it's practice every day, because every context, every person we're in communication with is going to be different. So it's really learning just that awareness and the levels of how am I being asked to show up in this conversation? Or as the speaker, how am I being asked to lead this conversation? And from there, you continue to communicate and then reflect with each conversation and say, how did that feel? Like, what did I learn from that situation? And we're human, so we're still going to open mouth insert foot, like, because we have our own emotions and our own sense of urgency and our own passions that our amigos are often not, our egos are not our amigos, is how that goes, right? We want to defend our egos, and it's often not our friend. So thank you all once again.
I would say you accomplished your goal. It was a really, really beautiful couple weeks with you. And I'm so grateful for it. I needed this. It was really good for me. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for gracing me with your time and your great questions and participation. It makes it so much easier to talk about how it relates to people. And then Kathy, I have not forgotten your question about the concept of when I hear something important that I want to remember, and then oftentimes you don't. And having that be when somebody starts to speak that and you make that connection a couple of words in, to do that physical move of placing your feet under you and making that eye contact if you can, if you're on camera. If not, envision them in your mind. And so you're shifting that presence and that energy and then relating it to something. Why is that important for you at that moment? And see if that strategy helps, because it's that physical stop and then connecting it to something meaningful. And that meaningful could be that other person that you're speaking to, that you just haven't given that shift to give attention. You're paying attention.
And you just described getting present, putting your feet down, feeling where you are. So that being present creates the connection. And when you were closing a minute ago, you said, and have these conversations and then just see how you feel. And I think that was a really, really key sentence out of everything, was to evaluate with how you feel instead of how you think. Because we get that feeling when we're present, which is what you're advocating. So I love that.
Awesome. Thank you. Steve, Marissa, Scott.
You've given us a lot to think about. I appreciate your thoughts. I'm still processing it. A
It
lot
is
of it. I'll probably have to message you with some follow-up questions.
Absolutely. Again, this is the idea of dialogue. There's not a right or wrong. We're all in discovery. So, all right. Happy Monday to each of you. I look forward to seeing you in future Outlier conversations, and I'm always open to one-on-one calls too, just to connect. So
Thanks.
thanks so much.
Everybody remember that Nate Boyer rescheduled, so he will not be on tomorrow at noon, but he will be with us in November, and he's got a really good excuse. So we'll cheer him on from the theaters. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.